Hello everyone, welcome. I'm sweating a little bit, sorry. Welcome back. I'm Chris. This is Creepiest Cases of People Disappearing. I almost said disturbing. From Scary Interesting. See me click that thumbs up. If you could do that for me, that helps tremendously. I'm going to put this out. I uploaded a video yesterday. Today's the 7th. Not yesterday. I uploaded a video today. And for whatever reason, it just didn't go through. So I only had one video up today. So I do apologize. It's August 7th. But tomorrow I'll put up 3. This will probably be one of them, just because I'm explaining it now. So, didn't realize it until I was at work. Nothing I could do there. Had to come back and delete the video and then re-upload it. So, sorry about that. But like I say, if you could click that thumbs up button for me, that helps tremendously. You can subscribe to the channel, that helps as well. And if you want to donate to the channel, you can do that through the thanks button. You can also request a video. And after you donate, request a video, and your name will be sponsoring for that video. You can still request videos, it just takes a little bit longer to get to. So let's get into the creepiest cases of people disappearing.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting. In this video, we're going to go over 3 incredibly creepy unsolved disappearances. In the final story, you'll think you know what's going on, and that the story is cut and dry, but there is something found at the end which completely changes everything, and it is horrifying. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On the evening of March 31st, 2006, 27-year-old Brian and his father Randy were sitting at a table inside an Outback Steakhouse in Columbus, Ohio. Brian was a successful student working his way through medical school, and just earlier that day he attended his last class before the official start of spring break. Brian and his longtime girlfriend Alexis also had plane tickets to spend the week in Miami, and the couple was very much looking forward to the trip. He had even dropped a few hints that he might pop the question, but as big a deal as that was, the father and son could only focus on one topic. 3 weeks earlier, Randy's wife and Brian's mother Renee tragically passed away after a battle with cancer. The family was a close family, and along with Brian's brother Derek, they remained so even with Brian in the midst of a demanding medical school curriculum. In fact, staying close to the family was one of the biggest reasons Brian stuck around to attend Ohio State University. His plans for the future were a source of pride for the family, and his parents were looking forward to the next phase of their lives, which they hoped would include grandchildren one day. It's tragic how quickly things changed, and such happy hopes of the future were the furthest thing from their minds over dinner. When they finished eating, the two walked to the parking lot and shared a long hug before they went their separate ways. It was a cathartic conversation for both of them, and Brian felt the need to blow off some steam that night. So at around 9 p.m., he called Alexis to check in and let her know that he and his friend Clint were going to head out for some bar hopping. With how distraught Brian had been since his mom's passing, Alexis was encouraged to see him wanting to have some fun, so she told him she loved him and wished him a fun and safe night out. The two friends then started going from bar to bar, stopping to have a shot at each before moving on to the next to do the same there. Just after midnight on April 1st, Brian and Clint ran into a mutual friend Meredith at a bar, and the three decided to finish the night at the Ugly Tuna Saloon, which was a restaurant by day and live music club by night.
What a name. The Ugly Tuna Saloon.
The three friends arrived at 1:15 a.m., and with the bar set to close at 2 a.m., they had just made it before last call. Then, after enjoying a drink together, Brian got separated from them and resurfaced at 1:55 a.m. when he was seen outside the Ugly Tuna saying goodbye to 2 women. As they turned to leave, Brian then re-entered the saloon. Minutes after he turned back to go inside, Clint and Meredith stood waiting for him in front of the bar to head home, but Brian never showed up. After a while, they figured he must have walked back or found another ride, so the two said goodbye before going their separate ways. This was the last time Brian was ever seen, and it didn't take long later that day for those close to Brian to realize something was very wrong. Alexis didn't hear from Brian at all on April 1st, which was highly unusual. Derek also couldn't get a hold of him, and initially both he and Alexis figured he was just sleeping off the night out. They also entertained the possibility that Brian was playing a joke on them. It was April Fool's Day after all, but soon enough it was clear that it wasn't a joke. Alexis eventually went over to his apartment and let herself in, but it was immediately clear that Brian hadn't returned the night before. Her anxiety immediately increased as she found this and decided to wait in the apartment until he came home, but he just never did. April 1st then ended, and April 2nd didn't produce any sign or word of him either. However, with 2 plane tickets for April 3rd and a trip the couple had been counting down toward, Brian had to show up before they were scheduled to leave. But that just didn't happen either. With his friends and family by then extremely concerned about him, the police were contacted and Brian was reported missing. The case fell to the Columbus Police Department, and after learning about Brian's movements on the night he disappeared, they requested security footage from the Ugly Tuna. The video backed up what they were told by Clint and Meredith, but as they continued to watch the footage, minutes went by after Brian ran to the saloon. By the time the tape ended, there was absolutely no sign of him anywhere, and of the ways out of the saloon, only one was not covered by a security camera. There was a back door that musicians used to load in and out of, and exiting that door would have put Brian in the middle of a construction area. But even without a camera at that door to catch him leaving, there were cameras from other bars that would have picked him up in that area, yet he was never seen again after re-entering the Ugly Tuna. When Brian exited the camera frame that night, it was like he vanished out of thin air. The subsequent investigation included hundreds of interviews with witnesses and people close to Brian. Video footage from his night out was scrutinized over and over again, but police only hit dead end after dead end. While gathering as much information as possible, police were monitoring Brian's cell phone, bank account, and credit card for any activity, but there was none. So, based on the information they had, police narrowed down what may have happened to Brian down to 3 possibilities. The first was that he walked away from his life to start a new one elsewhere. The second was that he left the bar and went somewhere to end things. And the final was that his disappearance was the result of foul play. Every one of these possibilities had issues, though. The whole family was reeling at the time, and the dinner with Randy earlier that night on March 31st was an emotional one, but before the two parted ways, Brian assured his father that he'd be okay. Of course.
The only thing I can think of is that he was okay. Yeah. Wow, what was I going to say? The only thing I could think of, here it is that he really was just going to like move on, start something new, just kind of quit his life. I don't mean kill himself, but just quit his life, move on. The only way he could have done that is by getting away from those people, his friends, meeting someone who would have established like, here you go, here's a bag with some clothes, go change, I'll take the bag, the backpack or whatever, and I'll walk it because I'm the same, but now I have your clothes. He walks out undescribed, or is that the word? He's not noticeable in terms of what he walked in with and what he walked out with, and he just left. I mean, the other foul play, it would seem like it, but how do you get him, if you kill him, how do you get him out if he never left? I don't know.
Of course, this isn't enough to rule out the potential of leaving his stressful life behind, but as the days passed since he disappeared, his case had garnered national attention. Sightings of him were called in from all over, even as far away as Sweden, but each of them either went unconfirmed or was determined to be someone else. So next, Brian's state of mind being what it was at the time, it was possible he'd decide to end things instead of starting a new life. However, at first, nothing he said or did led anyone around him to believe Brian was suffering from anything outside the normal and expected course of grief over losing a loved one. Still, it was possible that Brian somehow slipped out of the saloon, maybe being blocked on camera by another patron leaving the bar, and went somewhere to do this. Police conducted a thorough search of the building as well as the sewer system and local waterways, but nothing came up. This seemed to rule out the possibility that Brian had done something drastic, but interviews with Alexis turned up a couple of interesting occurrences in the weeks between his mother's death and his disappearance. Soon after his mother's funeral, Brian came to her distraught and begged her to run away with him somewhere, and just days before he vanished, he suggested to Alexis that she leave him and find someone else because he was having such a hard time with his mother's death. She obviously agreed to neither suggestion, but if nothing else, it gave police insight into his emotional state at the time. So finally, foul play was looked at, but it seemed the unlikeliest of all. As the investigation got going, police interviewed everyone who crossed Brian's path that day. Since Clint was with him from 9 o'clock until around 1:30 am, he was a high-value witness who was initially cooperative with police and answered any questions they had for him. When he was asked to take a polygraph test, however, he suddenly hired a lawyer who advised him not to talk to police.
Yeah, I wouldn't have taken a polygraph, lie detector test either. They're not admissible in court, and it can be finagled any which way to make you look bad. So, yeah, no, I wouldn't take it either.
Even more than 18 years later, it's always been curious to Derek that Clint was supposedly one of Brian's best friends, yet he may have been withholding information.
Just because you lawyer up doesn't mean you're instantly guilty. I hate when that gets suggested like that. He lawyered up because he's protecting himself. He's a witness. And the police would love to pin it on him and then move on to the next case. The faster they can just close a case, the happier they are. So, yeah, I totally understand getting a lawyer. Never go in and just talk to the police willingly. No. What are you doing?
At the same time, when looking at the timeline that's backed up by security footage, it leaves very little opportunity for Clint to do much of anything, let alone murder Brian and somehow remove his body from the building. Only 5 minutes pass between Brian re-entering the saloon and Clint and Meredith waiting outside for him. Because Clint stopped providing information, however, there's an entire period between 9 p.m. on March 31st and the first few minutes of April 1st when Clint and Brian were alone together, and that's a big question mark. It's possible that in the course of their bar hopping before running into Meredith, Brian told Clint about the plan to run away and made him promise never to say anything to anyone about it. Whatever the case, following his disappearance, Derek and Alexis spent a year calling Brian's phone multiple times every day, hoping it would be picked up by someone on the other end, but the calls always went to voicemail. That was until 6 months after Brian vanished. During one attempt to reach him, the phone actually rang before going to voicemail, and it pinged a cell tower near Hilliard, a northwest suburb of Columbus. This was investigated, but nothing ever came from it, unfortunately. Even more tragically, tragedy wasn't done for the family after Brian's disappearance. No one searched for Brian more than his father did, and he spent every single day for 2 years putting up flyers and keeping his son's face in the public eye. It's unclear exactly what he was doing at the time, but he was hit by a falling tree limb during a windstorm and was killed on impact. This meant that Derek had lost his mother, father, and brother over the course of a little more than 2 years, and what happened to Brian that night is still a mystery. It didn't take more than one look at Tom Messick to know that he had lived some life in his 82 years on Earth. He wasn't particularly imposing at 5'10", 160 pounds, but the signs were there nonetheless. In his 20s, Tom was a member of the prestigious and storied 82nd Airborne Division in the United States Army, serving as a paratrooper. During his service, Tom lost an eye and half his hearing in an explosion that also managed to mangle one of his hands so badly that it needed 159 stitches. This should have killed him, and the accident would have been life's defining moment for many, but not for Tom. His life was all about survival, and this was just another event he managed to live through. Later, he became an avid hunter and outdoorsman and loved it so much that he taught hunting and survival classes in and around his hometown in Troy, New York, about 160 miles north of New York City. Not even his age was enough to keep Tom out of the woods, especially when it came to an annual hunting trip he took with his friends and family. In 2015, though, Tom was just getting over a bad case of shingles with that year's trip quickly approaching. He was still dealing with some of the lingering effects, and he had to consider the possibility of staying home that year. When the time came, however, Tom decided that he was well enough to go. After all, he didn't know how many more he'd have a chance to attend at his age. As tough as he was, the age was finally catching up to him. His later years had brought about some heart problems, and he didn't get around as well as he used to, so hunting for him had to be a bit modified. Either way, on November 15th, Tom joined 6 other friends and family members for a hunt on Lily Pond near Brant Lake, about an hour's drive north of his home in Troy. And Tom was excited for the trip. Even though he had been hunting with some members of the group for 55 years, none of them had ever been in that era, which was surprising considering how popular it was for fishing and hunting. At around 10 a.m., Tom and several of the older members in the group were put in position by the younger men with them. A couple of them were placed on watch just off a logging route, and Tom was assisted to an old tree stump to sit. Because he couldn't go after deer himself, the others would go to the other side of the lake and drive them right to him so he could take a shot. When Tom was settled, the younger men walked off to start spooking deer toward his location, but they returned to the tree stump without finding any. By the time they got back, about an hour had passed, and somewhere within that time, Tom disappeared. The group initially thought he might have gone to relieve himself, but shouting his name received no response. Because he was deaf in one ear, it was possible that Tom just didn't hear him, but his limited mobility meant that he should have been within the range of his hearing. For hours afterward, the rest of his hunting group searched, and then when 4:30 came without finding any sign of him, the group called the police and reported him missing. At that point, half of them returned to the cabin, and the other half remained behind, shooting their rifles and honking the car horn in hopes of helping Tom find them. Around midnight, the search was suspended, and a renewed effort would begin the next morning, involving 13 different search and rescue agencies. The search for Tom would be one of the most extensive in the history of the Adirondack Mountains. Locals even thought initially that a celebrity had gone missing because of all the activity in the area, and search and rescue teams would go on to use helicopters equipped with heat-detecting cameras, dogs, and an extensive grid system that should have easily found him, but that just didn't happen. Part of this was due to the conditions at Brant Lake in November that made the search challenging. By mid-November, the forest floor was coated in about 8 inches of leaves that had recently fallen. If it was summertime, there was a good chance Tom would have left behind footprints, but the thickness of the leaves made that impossible. Creating further problems was the heavy rain that moved into the air and remained for several days. This was where the methodical planning was supposed to give searchers the advantage. In 2008, a book was published called Lost Person Behavior, a search and rescue guide on where to look for land, air, and water. This book was written by a behaviorist named Robert Coaster, and as a rescuer, he has a 96% success rate in finding people missing in the outdoors. His book was the beginning of a whole new way of planning searches based on scientific studies, and one of the most important factors those studies identified is timing. The first 24 hours are crucial as the likelihood of finding a missing person alive starts to plummet as early as the second day of a search, especially when it involves someone of Tom's age. Another thing the book does is lay out the types of decisions lost people tend to make, emphasizing that missing people don't always think rationally, especially missing people who are being controlled by the anxiety that comes with being lost. In planning the search for Tom, team leaders also used mathematical probability models and something called Bayesian search theory. This essentially quantifies variables and calculates the probability of different events. This can include anything from past relevant results to personal gut feelings, and the probabilities change as new data comes in. Using this method, search and rescue teams can create fine-tuned probability maps that indicate where the highest likelihood of finding a missing person or object lies. High-profile cases in which it's already been used include the search for the USS Scorpion, which was a US Navy submarine that sank in 1968, and the disappearance of Malaysian Airlines Flight 370. However, the search dragged on despite the methodical approach and was conducted daily all the way until January 2016. By that point, experienced search and rescue team members were beyond baffled. Not a single shred of evidence connected to Tom has ever been found. In the meantime, several state and federal agencies, including the FBI, worked together to determine if there was any foul play involved in Tom's disappearance. Initially, investigators didn't see any reason to believe that Tom's disappearance was the result of abduction or murder, but the interview Tom's wife Beverly did with the FBI said otherwise. Beverly answered all their questions to the best of her ability, but few of hers received answers. The one thing the FBI did tell her, however, was they believed something wasn't quite right with the case. They just didn't know what it was. It's also worth noting that Beverly didn't think Tom got lost. The Tom she knew was an outdoor survival expert even at his age. She believed someone on an ATV encountered Tom and either frightened him off the tree stump, causing him to run off, or abducted him. Other family members believed that Tom probably wandered off and got lost, or he had a medical emergency.
How would somebody on like a four-wheeler or an ATV, you can hear that. So why would that have scared you if you're in a deer stand? That I don't understand. Unless the person was acting crazy and like yelling and screaming at him, and it caused him to get out of the tree and try to run to where the others were, because they didn't say, they just said others. But they would have found, well, I shouldn't say that. I was going to say they would have found tire tracks, but that's not, it could be a tract of land that is common to, man, these are difficult. Yeah. I don't know.
In the area of his disappearance, there were also caves, crevices, and the remnants of old abandoned mines that could have easily swallowed Tom up too. As with many of these disappearances, people always put forward the potential of alien abduction. One of his hunting friends was even interviewed and said that on the day Tom vanished, he heard a noise about 150 yards uphill from him near Tom's location. This noise was apparently unlike anything he'd ever heard before, to the point where he couldn't even describe it. There are also some other strange circumstances, although it's always hard to tell if these are revisionist versions of the events by the people involved. Apparently, the biggest thing that stood out to the group was that the woods were completely devoid of wildlife. Not only did they not see a single animal that day, they didn't hear one either. It was apparently abnormally quiet, and several in the group even told police that it was like something was keeping the animals away. Whatever the case, as of 2024, the search for Tom is ongoing, only on a much more limited basis, and not a single trace of him has ever been discovered. March 26, 1991 was a historic day for South Korea. It had been 30 years since the last local elections had taken place, but they had been reinstated, giving cities and towns a level of autonomy that had been missing. It was a renewed opportunity for South Koreans to have a say in their communities by electing council members, mayors, and other positions after living under military rule for several decades. The day was even marked as a national holiday, giving everyone the opportunity to exercise their right to vote. Understandably, the media coverage of the elections was extensive to witness the country's slow return to democracy. However, while much of South Korea was focused on the many elected positions up for grabs, it couldn't have been further from the minds of 5 boys between the ages of 9 and 13 living in a village outside the city of Daegu. The boys had plans of their own for their rare Tuesday with no school, and like many kids their age, they were fascinated with wildlife, so they were going out to look for frogs and salamanders. At around 9 o'clock that morning, Jong-woo's front door flew open, and his son, Cheo-woon, hurried in, checked through the closet, and grabbed a coat. The one he'd initially worn wasn't warm enough for the near-freezing temperatures that day, so he stopped back home for a thicker one. As he turned to rush back out, Jong-woo asked his son where he was going, but the only reply he received was the sound of the door shutting. Whether he was too excited about frog catching to hear his father, or he knew that answering honestly ran the possibility of sabotaging his plans for the day, Cheo-won hurried back to catch up with his friends. He was the oldest of the group of 5, and at 13 years old was seen as the leader of the group, so without him the plans might have been ruined if his father didn't let him go. Had he answered his father though, it may have averted one of South Korea's most shocking and enduring mysteries. Several hours later, at around 1 that afternoon, Jong-woo's phone rang. On the other line was Cheo-won's instructor from the Taekwondo academy he attended. Apparently, he hadn't shown up for a scheduled class. This immediately raised an alarm for Jong-woo. He knew his son as a responsible young man, and he never would have skipped his lesson for whatever he was up to earlier that day. Thankfully, all 5 of the boys were closer than brothers, and they had all grown up together despite their different ages. And in their village, the houses the boys lived in formed almost a circle around a field. So Jong-woo then grabbed his coat and began going door to door to each of the boys' houses. But then he grew even more concerned when he realized none of the parents knew where they went either. He also learned that each of the boys had been somewhat secretive about their plans for the day, meaning that not only were they missing, but they had no idea where they'd gone. Undeterred by this, the parents knew one of their favorite spots to hang out was Mount Warryong, so that's where the search started. While making their way up a mountain path, Jong-woo ran into a friend who said he saw the boys earlier and inquired about what they were up to. For him, the boys actually answered the question and told him about the frogs and salamanders, and based on the direction they were heading at the time, the mountain seemed to be the right place to start looking. A little while later though, and after searching around their usual spots, when they were unable to locate their sons, the parents were worried enough to call the police to report them missing. However, the response they received was sort of unusual. The police seemed to immediately write the boys off as some runaways who would turn up eventually if the parents were just patient enough. This dismissiveness only increased the tension the families were feeling, and they began pointing fingers at one another for not keeping a close enough eye on the boys. Then, as the afternoon turned to evening, reporters caught wind of the missing boys, but most outlets couldn't be bothered to cover the story with the landmark elections that day. The parents tried to appeal to newspapers and TV stations, but they received the same response they got from the police to just wait and they would eventually turn up. Several days went by without a word of the boys' disappearance being uttered to the public, but then by the 1-week mark after the election coverage had dissipated, it turned into nationwide news. The public was quickly glued to the story, and the media continued following it. A popular news program called the Square of Public Opinion even reached out to the parents and asked if they'd come on as guests. By that point, the police were still dragging their feet on the investigation and weren't taking the disappearance seriously, and the parents made sure to make this extremely clear as they did interviews. Then, unexpectedly, while taking phone calls from the viewing audience, a sobbing voice came over the live broadcast. The audience in the studio and at home were stunned, and before anyone could respond to it, the call cut off. A telephone operator then came on the line and claimed that it was one of the 9-year-olds who had gone missing, and he was begging for his mother, which caused the studio audience to erupt in cheers. To them, this was proof that the boys were still alive, and if they were still alive, there was reason to have hope. But then, sadly, shortly afterward, the call was determined to be a prank, and the search was back to square one. This appearance wasn't for nothing though. The show also caught the attention of the South Korean president, who then made a statement after it aired. He announced that he was devoting 300,000 police officers to a nationwide search, as well as opening a special investigation headquarters. Afterwards, searches were conducted in waterways, reservoirs, and even bus stations all over the country. A reward equivalent to $35,000 was offered for any information that led to finding the boys, and over the course of an entire year, thousands of volunteers were involved in more than 500 organized searches of Mount Warryong. Unfortunately though, not one of these efforts went anywhere. During that span, all 5 of the boys' fathers quit their jobs to search for their sons. They then pooled their money together and rented a small truck, which they fitted with large signs meant to garner attention on the images of the 5 boys. Together, they drove from villages to towns to cities all over South Korea, handing out flyers and trying to uncover that one tip that would lead to the boys. This long, arduous tour ended up being fruitless, and every day that passed without some kind of positive news wore on some of the fathers more than others. One of them would dream about his son so often that he became afraid to sleep and became addicted to sleeping pills as a result. Others turned to alcohol, and the truck tour around the country eventually put the men in so much debt that they had to abandon the daily searches and return to the workforce. 2 years after returning to work and 5 years after the disappearance of their sons, the fathers had all mostly gotten their lives back on track. They had little choice but to move on, but their sons were always on their minds. As this new normal was setting in, a criminal psychologist who had taken it upon himself to investigate the disappearance came forward with a troubling theory. He believed that the father of one of the boys was responsible for killing them all and then buried them in his basement. The number of criminal psychologists in South Korea at the time was minimal, and this particular one had studied in the US for a while, which gave him a lot of credibility in the public's eyes. So the accusation sparked police into action, and a search was conducted at the house, which included digging up the basement with an excavator. Media coverage was wall-to-wall of the search, and cameras were even allowed into the basement to capture the dig. When the entire basement was virtually destroyed, with no bodies being found though, the psychologist ran into the house and pushed his way through the crowd outside. Once they learned that his accusations were false, the angry mob chased after him. He even eventually had to be picked up by police and brought to the station for his own safety. And tragically, 5 years later, that same father died of liver cancer at the age of 49, which was a condition believed to be exacerbated by the stress of his son's disappearance and the psychologist's claims. Another year after that, and the story continued fading from the media spotlight. However, the remaining fathers continued to go to newspapers and TV stations in the country's capital, begging for any coverage of the case, only to be escorted out of each and every building. A year after the death of that one father, and 11 years following the boy's disappearance, 2 men were gathering acorns on Mount Warryung when one of them came across a tangle of skeletal remains sticking out of the ground. These bones belonged to the 5 boys, who would become known as the Frog Boys afterward. Police then came to the scene immediately, and street officers with no experience or understanding of how to properly excavate a body began digging the bones out. This was already bad enough for the integrity of the evidence, but instead of keeping the bones of each body together, they sorted them according to likeness, putting skulls with skulls, femurs with femurs, vertebrae with vertebrae, and so on. So by the time forensic scientists arrived 2 hours after the call came in, the police had completely mixed up the bodies with no way of telling which bones belonged to which boys. Either way, the next day police held a press conference and announced that the likely cause of death was hypothermia. The day the boys went missing was already cold and wet, and that night more rain came in as temperature dipped to 3 degrees Celsius or about 37 degrees Fahrenheit. These conditions would have almost certainly caused hypothermia, and initially the bunched up bodies and the clothing of one of the boys that had been tied together were seen as proof that they huddled together for warmth. When the clothes were untied though, both live bullets and empty cartridges came pouring out of the bundle, and a further examination of the skulls was even more troubling. 3 of the 5 had signs of blunt force trauma, likely caused by some kind of metal instrument or tool, suggesting foul play. This was then only underscored by the fact that the bodies were found less than 2 kilometers from their homes in an area they knew well. As many had already suspected, the chances of them getting lost and dying of hypothermia were seeming very unlikely. In the wake of this discovery, theories and rumors went wild, and police put forward the possibility of a pattern killer, but no similar crime scenes were found before or after the boys went missing. What is seen as the strongest theory of all points to something at the top of Mount Warryung. In addition to a pond near the summit, there was a South Korean army base where an infantry division was stationed. As part of the base, there was a shooting range. Because of the national holiday for elections, there were no drills conducted that day, but commissioned officers were allowed to shoot at any time they pleased. The boys were found only 100 to 200 meters downrange, well within the capabilities of the rifles used there. There are reports that one officer did visit the range that day to shoot off some extra bullets he had, but it was never determined who exactly that was. At least one set of parents believe that all the boys were killed to cover up one of them being shot accidentally, but that's never been confirmed. It was confirmed, however, that the bullets found among the boys' clothing were unquestionably from the army base, but an investigation of the military base and its occupants was never conducted by police or the government. In the years that followed, the parents collectively sued police 3 times for negligence in their investigation, but they lost all 3 lawsuits. As for the boys, after being stored in a lab for several years, their remains were returned to their parents for a proper burial. Because the bones were all mixed together, they were cremated together too, and just as in life, the Frog Boys are together in death, as the mystery of what happened to them remains.
That one hurts. Oh, that one hurts.
So, I'm curious to hear what you think happened in each of the stories, and you can let me know down in the comments.
On the last one, I'm wondering if the boys were going up. Maybe they heard a guy shooting. So they decided, let's check out the military base. Maybe they knew there wasn't going to be anyone there. They heard shooting or whatever. They go up, they're looking around. They see bullet casings, and they're just like, oh, look. And they take some bullet casings. And then they go walking on away, going back to where they were, and they encounter somebody who's just walking through, and the person just kills them. You know, like the person at the army base had nothing to do with it. He just happened to be there. Yeah, because they didn't say any of the bones showed signs of bullet holes. It just showed signs of like being beaten with something. So maybe the bullet hole, the shell casings were just, you know, they picked them up while, you know, they were, I don't know. That's terrible. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed the video, but in a non-weird way when I say that. Like, you just, like, oh, it was a good video. You know, hopefully they'll be able to find what happened, but it's just, it's a shot in the dark, really. But anyways, I'm going to end it here. If you have any requests, let me know. Throw some things in the comments. I try to reply back to you as soon as I can, and to everyone. But until next time, have a good day, have a good night.